So I want to introduce the baking unit. For the baking unit, as an instructor, it is a little difficult for me to completely scale down all of the things that I want to teach. I could teach an entire course just on baking and pastry and desserts. In fact, if you move on to culinary school, then more than likely you will have one or two classes in the baking and pastry arts and the science behind it. If you move on to baking or pastry school, you would have many, many classes on each individual topic. So this unit is really only going to focus on the bare minimal and building a foundation of knowledge for you on the equipment, the terminology, ingredient function, and a little bit of the science and chemistry behind baking. Baking is very much related to chemistry. It is very much a science. In chemistry, you don't necessarily have a recipe, you have a formula. And in baking, you do as well. We're even going to get into how to mathematically change that formula so that you could even create your own baked goods and create your own recipe or formula. It's important to know and understand the ingredients and how they function. So, when we look at baking and we look at the categories of ingredients, ultimately, regardless of what baked good you're making, you're going to use pretty much the same ingredients: a cookie, a cake, a brownie, donuts, yeast bread, pie crust. These things are very similar in their ingredients. The difference is the formula, the ratios that you use of ingredients, and the technique that you use to put them together. There are times in baking that you want to melt or have ingredients room temperature or melted. And there are other times, depending on your product, that you want to have your ingredient very cold. It's really important to understand the technique and to understand the terminology. So that's really what I'm going to focus on in this unit and build those bare foundational skills. Baking is pretty cheap and it's pretty easy. It's pretty common. Most people like baked goods. You can kind of mess up a baked good recipe pretty often or pretty well and still get an edible product. It may not be super desirable. Maybe your pancakes or your waffles are a little tough. Understanding how that came to be and how you can make that better or different ultimately will make you a better baker and a better cook. So just like cooking methods is really important foundational knowledge for being a cook and that cooking element, the baking foundation is really important to understand how to make good baked goods. So when we talk about baker's ingredients, these are the categories here. Let me see if I can pick my thing up. Here we go. Awesome. So when we look at baking ingredients, there's always going to be something that provides structure. So ultimately, those are the bricks of your house. You've got to have something that holds everything up and holds everything together. Most commonly, that structure is going to be flour. There are flourless recipes. They're different. They're not going to bake up quite the same, but there are some recipes for people that choose not to have flour either for low carb diets, like a keto diet, or because they have gluten intolerance. There's flours that don't have gluten. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Fats and shortenings, they have a function and purpose. When we talk about fat or shortening, we are talking about solids like butter or liquids like oils. Sweeteners, these are going to add color. These are going to add flavor. There's a lot of different varieties. Again, you have a refined, like a white sugar or a dry sugar, but you also have a liquid component like honey or corn syrup or molasses. Leavening makes things puffy. And so leavening is going to make things rise. You have chemical, which act immediately. You have yeast, which takes some time. It's an organic substance. And then you have steam or air. These are your physical ones. Thickeners are going to help bind and hold things together. These are generally in the form of starch, like cornstarch or flour, but eggs are also a binding agent as well. Flavorings there's a huge variety. Vanilla extract is the most common, but there is cocoa. There are all kinds of fruit extracts, such as lemon and anise and almond and nut extracts, lots of different flavoring agents and components, and they're all going to add something different. Extracts are very strong, though. You do want to be careful how much you're adding into there. You don't pour a whole bunch in there. They come in little bottles and they're very potent. Liquids in baking are going to do lots of things. Sometimes a liquid actually makes things happen. Like it makes gluten develop, which we'll talk about. It activates chemical leaveners. And so liquid is a really important component. It holds things together, it melts things. Water and milk, cream, eggs, honey, molasses, butter, these oils, these things all add liquids to a recipe. And then you have your additives. Additives don't always necessarily change the ultimate component. They add flavor and they add some texture, but it's usually not the base of the recipe. So what I mean by additives, chocolate chips would be an additive, candies, food coloring, nuts, and spices. It's really important to note when it comes to spices, like cinnamon and nutmeg and allspice and mace, they don't change the overall component of the recipe. What I mean by this is if there's one you don't like, I don't like clove. I really, really dislike clove. I don't like the smell of it. I don't like the taste of it. Pumpkin pie, apple pie, sometimes they call for clove in those recipes. I can completely leave that out and it's not going to change the overall recipe. Cinnamon, you can leave cinnamon out of pretty much everything except a cinnamon roll and still get the same product. You can add something like a little cinnamon into a recipe and get a little bit different flavor, but it's not really going to change the overall baked good product. So additives are good. It's good to know about them for the most part. You can leave them out or add them in. If you make chocolate chip cookies, leave the nuts out, put some nuts in. In the end, you're not really changing your recipe as much with the additives. So this is the basic category of the ingredients. We're going to go through each ingredient. We're going to talk about the types. We're going to talk about the function. Then we're going to work on quick breads and do a muffin recipe. And then we're going to look at the science of cookies. Because when you look at ingredient function, cookies have a huge range of changing those ingredients around and getting different things. Some people like cakey or soft, say chocolate chip cookies. Some people like them thin or crispy. So we're really going to look at the science behind that before we wrap up this unit and we wrap up this year in our class.